Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to talk about this sword right here. It's the Iron Tiger Forge Mitsudomoe Katana from Cult of Athena. And as is customary, I will go over some disclaimers at the start. One, this is a review sample from Cult of Athena. They sent it to me after I requested it. I saw a video actually that they produced on it, and I will link that in the description down below, as well as measurements and other bits and bobs and fits and data points and things like that if you're interested. Anyway, they agreed and sent it my way, so do know that I'll put a link in the description where you can buy one if you're so inclined to do so. I believe they're only available at Cult of Athena as well. I think they're the exclusive retailer for the Iron Tiger Forge brand, and I think it's like an in-house brand, though I'm not entirely sure about the relationship with the Forge. Anyway, I think you can only get them at Cult of Athena, and a link will be down there below. Other bits to note is that I do study Japanese-style swordsmanship, but I'm not particularly good at it. I've come a long way. If you look at my videos from 10 years ago, I swing them around better, but I got a long way to go before I can call myself good. So keep my experience and expertise as a practitioner in mind as you hear my thoughts and babblings. This video is going to cover the build quality, the bits, bob, fit features, and hopefully you can mute the audio if you're sick of hearing me talking and look at it and see if it's worth your money or not. From there, I will go out and push the sword to the point of failure, which, incidentally, I have already done. Sneak surprise, it broke. And so I'll talk about that. I used it for about a month for Iaido and practice, and I can talk about the experience of doing that as well as what it took to push it all the way to failure. So anyway, that's what's going to be in the video. Hopefully it's interesting. If it is, then look forward to hearing me babble on for the better part of an hour now. Okay, so beginning the video, the bit bob fits features, it's important to highlight how much does it cost. And right now at Cult of Athena, it's about $350. I don't think that includes shipping, so it might be a little bit more, but they would be shipped from inside the US, so it's hopefully not a horribly large shipping bill. Anyway, it's about $350. That's the context that I'm going to keep in mind, or the kind of thought I'm going to keep in mind as compared to other swords in that general ballpark. And that's not the least expensive sword, but it's also not the most expensive sword. And what you get is a whole bunch of little features. There's some silk ito, there's real ray skin, or at least it appears to be real ray skin. It's a differentially hardened blade, and Cult of Athena also has this program where they evaluate what type of steel is actually used. A lot of manufacturers disclose the type of steel, but you don't necessarily know if it is in fact what they say it is, and Cult of Athena has taken some measures to make sure that, that the steel inside this sword is what is disclosed. So anyway, there's some cool stuff like that, but I digress. It's $350, and what the steel is made from and all of the little fits and features, those are important if you're looking for them, but I don't tend to fixate too much on what the steel quality is. I look at how it performs when I go smash it in my backyard. So anyway, and how good it feels when I do Iaido with it and whatnot. So that's what I tend to focus on, and that's what I'm going to do now. All right, so as I do, I'm going to begin my review with the kasha, the pommel, this end bit right here. And shape-wise, it was nice. The transitions didn't really bother me. I think there was a little bit of overlap when it was all still together, but at the moment it's a little bit on the loose side. In terms of general usage, I think it held up well. Nothing bothered me, nothing hurt while I was doing EI with it. I did practice with it for about a month, and I used it quite a bit throughout that period, but no irritation, and overall it held up well. I also didn't notice that this patina was diminishing at all until I started throwing it at a tree and doing abusive stuff. So I think it'll probably hold up reasonably well. Any patina or paint will eventually come off if it's handled enough, but this seems overall pretty durable. It has kind of a stone texture and then a yin-yang or two-kama Mitsudomoe. I'm not sure if that's a thing or not, but it's a two kamas swirling on the kasha right here. And overall, it's handsome enough. I can't say that I'm a terrible fan of, or a big fan of the construction though. So it has this little tab rather than the cup that rests over wooden slats. It has this little tab that sticks out and pushes between the two wooden scales on the side here, and that's how it's held in along with a bit of adhesive. Now, I didn't have any problem with it loosening or wiggling around or doing anything while I was practicing with it, or even throughout the more abusive usage. It wasn't until really the end that it really came undone. And frankly, I could still glue it in here. Even though the ito is stretched a little bit, I could still glue this in and have it function once again. But I'm still not a fan. It's a departure from what the historic kasha are like, at least as far as I know. I haven't seen many with this little tab construction method here. So I'm not a big fan, but it's not a deal breaker for me if it keeps costs low and it makes the assembly easier. Functionally, it seemed to do all right. All right, moving on to the handle, the grip right here. Well, I've been talking about the handle, but moving specifically to the ito, it's a silk wrap, and overall the diamonds were a little haphazard. You know, they weren't necessarily terribly together, and it does feel like it wiggled around a little bit. Even from the start, I could kind of maneuver this ito. I could push it around a little bit. but it didn't come loose. There was no problems. The kashra stayed tight. The knot stayed tight. Nothing really tightened or loosened, but I didn't feel it loosening or being really problematic. It has kind of a supple feel. The silk feels nice to the hand. It doesn't feel cheapy, synthetic-y. It's kind of a pleasant overall feeling. And yeah, so it held up. I was concerned that it might come loose. It did not. I would say though that the panels underneath here, they're not recessed in the handle, so the where the panels rest against the silk is very prominent, and there are hishigami little paper triangles pressed underneath here, which maybe add to the feeling, you know, why it didn't come undone or anything like that. But it's somewhat unsightly, I guess I would say, as I can very clearly make out the panel lines, and after using it some, I can make out the hishigami. They start to poke out here and there, and that was something that that I noted, or that I noticed while I was using it, that over time the hishigami would become more apparent. I didn't notice them right out of the box, but after some time spending doing Iaido, I did start to notice that they would poke through, or that I could see them. But the handle held together overall well. I did find it to be reasonably comfortable. It indexed well. It's a little bit boxy, but honestly, it's not too big. I felt overall that it was reasonably comfortable. They're gold Minuki here as well, and they're not particularly well cast. They're okay, but they draw my eye kind of inherently when I look at the sword when it was together in one piece. These would be something that I could fixate on, so I didn't like those so much. But when the sword is drawn, the copper, or rather the brass habaki and brass seppa, kind of pull my eye together, and when it's out of the scabbard, I think it's a little bit more handsome than it's in the scabbard, and these start to show, or at least pull my eye away, and that's not something that I personally like, though. Personal choice on aesthetics. The core seems pretty thick, and I didn't notice that it was cracked. I didn't pull the handle off until later, and I do see a small crack here, but I'm gonna think that that's probably from some of the abusive testing that I did. The handle did, though, break, and so you can kind of see it's wiggling. Now if I bounce it around here like this, you can kind of see that there's a crack in here, and I bet if I pull, it will, yeah, it's straight up cracked right in here. That happened towards the middle of the really abusive stuff in terms of testing. It was a bit disappointing, but it still held together, and it broke right below the Minuki, so as long as I kept one hand up here, I felt reasonably safe. And as you can see, it's not easy to pull apart, though I guess I can. Anyway, moving on to the Fuchi up here, we can see that it basically matches, but in this particular case with the Fuchi, I can notice that either side has diminished the overall aesthetic. It's been like brushed or sanded, and it's lost that kind of stippling or the stonewash texture on the side, and it loses a little bit of the definition. Also, there's some kamas on here, but I can't make out the Mitsudomoe theme as well on the Fuchi as I might be able to on the kashra. Moving up from there, we have the tsuba. Now this is a Mitsudomoe style tsuba. I happen to really like the tsuba, so it drew me to it. I like the Mitsudomoe theme. As some of you that have watched my channel for a bit know that I have an odd obsession with this with this mon. This handle, or rather the tsuba, does seem to represent things that I've seen in historical Japanese tsuba, though these things that are cast in and protrude from the tsuba are usually inlaid in brass, or sometimes they're plated or something like that. They're stuck on. They don't usually protrude like this, though, even when they're inlaid in brass or something like that. I've had a few tsuba that look like this and have the inlay and kind of floral work on them, and they don't protrude the same way, but it's at least somewhat similar to the tsuba that I've seen historically, so that's not so bad. It doesn't have a whole lot of dimension, but it does have a swirly Mitsudomoe on it and some floral theme. If you wanted to, you could theoretically take like a brass or a gold Sharpie or something like that, and if you're handier than I am, there might be a way to do that without making it look terrible, and outline it a little bit with like a gold Sharpie, and it would probably come off and not hold up too well, but I didn't notice my hand rubbing on this too much when I was using it anyway. It might be a way to do a little bit of customization and add a little bit of flair, and if that was done, honestly, I think I'd like the look of it more, because my eye wouldn't just be pulled inherently to the Minuki. The habaki, simple brass habaki, tension was actually pretty good. The side didn't rattle too much, and overall the habaki, as simple as it is, was pretty effective. I do want to note that taking the handle off was also problematic, let's say. It was not fun to take off, but it eventually did come off. It was just it required a lot of percussive maintenance, if you will, some time with a rubber mallet to eventually get off. So that's one of the reasons I didn't pull it off prior to starting this video. if I move on to the saya, so right now, at least in this light, it might look a little bit black. I'm not sure how it's going to come out when I'm done editing it, but in the sun, this is a very deep brown, and it happens to be a color that I really like, because my eye totally thinks this is black inside, but when I get into a bright sunlight situation, I can very clearly see it's brown, and I like the change in colors. It has a kind of an Ishime finish, like a stone wash finish to it. I like this as well. It doesn't show fingerprints a lot, so if I'm using this in the dojo and I'm touching it, moving it around, it doesn't get gooped up too much. I can also kind of fix it with a Sharpie. If I bang it on the ground or drop it or something like that, I can put a Sharpie on it and it's not as apparent to the eye that it's been damaged. This one held up overall pretty well. It did, I think, rattle a little bit, but overall I would say it's comfortable. There's a little bit of wide space in here, so I did notice that my sword, I could kind of twist it around and get it to bind in here at times, but overall I got used to putting it in and out of the scabbard, and it wasn't too problematic, and it was overall pretty comfortable to use for iaido. Speaking of iaido, in terms of the blade, it wasn't very loud. So now you can see that it's broken, but when it was together, it wasn't a very loud blade. That was the only downside to really using it for iai. The handle and all that stuff really held up reasonably well. It was reasonably comfortable, but this wasn't a terribly loud tool, so I couldn't tell if I was doing things right. And as I noted, there was a little futzing to get it into the scabbard, but eventually I kind of found the right angle to put it in on, and once I got used to it, it wasn't problematic from there. So as a training tool, it seemed competent anyway. Blade-wise, if I talk about the shape, it's about 27.5 inches long, measured from the tip to the munmachi back here, and it has a nice curvature to it. It's not a terribly huge blade. It's also not small. It's somewhere on the in-between side, comfortable for iaido, big enough to cut with. It also came pretty sharp. I had no complaints about the sharp. It would kind of pop pool noodles apart pretty quickly. I tried to measure the hardness on it as well. Worth noting that my 40 file will bite in on the spine, and my 60 file doesn't really bite in on the edge. So it has a really hard edge, but the results of the really hard edge don't kind of match up with what I was seeing out when I was testing it, so I might not be doing it right. But I digress. The 40 file bit in on the spine towards the hamon. The 50 file seemed, or not the 50, the 60 file seemed to skate on the edge. So I would venture, I guess it's a little harder than 60 on the edge, but I'm not sure. Again, the result didn't kind of bear out with what I was experiencing outside. Anyway, blade-wise, the planes on this are smooth. It's, you know, obviously diminished now, but the planes on it were really smooth, and overall it seemed reasonably well shaped. The bohi termination kind of faded off and weren't necessarily terminated in the same spot, and the kasaki was geometric in nature but not terribly prominent, and it's more or less buffed, and so the hamon was somewhat difficult to see. It has a really beautiful, nice pattern to it. I actually like the look of the hamon. It's somewhat erratic in some spots, and it has some character to it, but it was tough to see without being in direct sunlight. But when you got it in sunlight or in the right light, it really has a lot to share, a lot to show. Anyway, it's pretty smooth, and also, incidentally, the bohi is an area where I typically see a lot of fluctuation, a lot more bouncing and stuff like that. They don't tend to get them as flat as they do the other planes, and this one is actually pretty clean. It doesn't have a lot of ripples and stuff in the surface, even in the bohi, which is uncommon, especially at swords in this price point. Anyway, last bit I can share is the nakago down here. Now, it's not signed, and there's not really any file marks, but overall this is simple. It's a reasonably clean nakago overall for the money. Sometimes companies put more energy into it. This is somewhere in the middle. It's certainly not the worst. It's not terribly shaped. I don't like how these lines jut in towards the hamachi, munmachi area here, but overall there's some file marking, some shape to it. There's burrs and stuff on here. Now, this isn't something that a lot of people are going to see. The handle is on there pretty tight, so if you did, you might cause some damage to taking the handle off. But it did come off. It didn't appear to be glued or anything like that. Attention to the detail in the nakago tells me what other attention to detail there might be in the rest of the sword. And so I like to see very detailed nakago. This doesn't happen to have one, but it's also not bad. It doesn't look like they were hiding anything or there's anything terrible going on underneath behind the curtain, so to speak. All right, anyway, that's the blade. Hopefully it's been interesting to see the bit Bob Fits features. If you have any questions on that, throw it in the commentary down below and I will try to answer it. But hopefully the videos and photo and whatnot will suffice and appease your curiosity around the details or build quality of the sword. Now I'm going to talk about using it, and then I'll talk about destroying it and pushing it to failure. Alright, so as I noted in the beginning, I practiced with the sword quite a bit over the last month, and I used it primarily as the main sword that I used to practice EI and whatnot. And overall, as I noted earlier in the review, it was a comfortable tool to do that. I was concerned that the handle would be boxy, that the ito might come loose, and I was a little bothered by the kind of not necessarily rattling in the side, but that I could get it to bind in some spots. But after I got used to it, honestly, it was a reasonably comfortable tool, and I didn't have a whole lot to complain about given the price point. It doesn't compete with a Japanese-made EI-to specifically made for that task. The ito isn't as tight, it doesn't glide in and out of the sai like it's on rails, but this is also a shenken, a live blade. It's sharp, it's not $300 Japanese-made EI-to don't function as swords, and this one does, so it certainly has a leg up in terms of features. At the same time, if you were buying something exclusively for EI-to, then I might recommend a different sword. This was still a comfortable tool if you want a shenken that can do both, and I found the weight to be, honestly, on the light side. It's not terribly heavy. I would say it's in the middle lightweight. That's usually where I classify the swords that are below 2.5 pounds is kind of the middle of the road, so this falls a little bit below that. And I didn't feel fatigue in using it for hours in class or anything like that. Overall, again, it was a pretty comfortable experience to use for EI if that's your thing. In terms of cutting, well, the first thing that I cut with it was something that's not quite a tatami substitute, but rolled paper with some other corrugate and stuff like that mixed in. And so I'm trying to find a solution or something else to cut other than tatami because it's very expensive and hard to find at the moment. I digress though. I cut some of these materials and it cut reasonably well, which suggests to me that it would be a reasonably effective tatami cutter. As I noted, it came really sharp out of the box and it cut something, frankly, a little bit denser and a little harder to cut than tatami pretty well. When I brought out a really big roll, it didn't cut through that, but it was, about 7 inches in diameter, about 6 inches in diameter, somewhere in there. So it's not a terrible surprise it didn't cut through that. It took a bigger blade with a big swing to move through it in one cut, but it did cut deeply into it. It didn't bend. I didn't notice any problems with that. The next thing that I cut was actually pool noodles on a different day, and again, sharp enough to just kind of pop right through the pool noodles. I found it to be a pretty comfortable experience doing that. It had a nice keen edge when popping through the pool noodles. It had like a hair popping sharp edge, honestly, which was nice to see. Once I cut some logs and stuff like that with it though, I noticed that I lost that hair popping edge, and if I tried to shave with it again, remove some arm hair, that it wouldn't do the same thing. So it did lose some of that hair popping edge, but it would still remain sharp. I wouldn't want to run my finger across it, but it lost the shaving sharp edge, which is why I say, like, I'm not sure about the hardness. I was not having luck getting my 60 HRC file to bite into the edge as I was scratching it on the base, but when I, and the 40 file would bite in, so I have a feel for how they bite. Anyway, there's some mild scratches left over on it, which is the cause of metal on metal, so maybe I'm misinterpreting the results. I digress though. It did lose edge quicker than I think other swords have, but at the same time it measures quite hard, so I don't really know what to make of that. The other thing to note is when I was cutting into logs, it not only lost its edge, but it bent really pretty easily. Now, once a bend started, I did a big swing on a dry branch. It's not a particularly hard wood. I think this is either maple or cottonwood, but it's dried and hardened. It's not a small branch, and I cut into it, and it took a big S shape and twisted. It was one of the worst bends that I've had on any sword from cutting this type of material. And once it bent, it honestly just kind of kept bending from here. So if I brought it to other wood targets or something like that, I would see that it would just kind of be relatively soft and bend pretty easily. So I took and struck it on trees, and I could bend it, and it would take a pretty decent bend, and then I'd whack it on the side of the stand and bend it back. If I intentionally slapped it on the side of my stand, then it would bend quite a bit and take a set relatively easily. And the more I did it, the easier it was, and the more consistently it happened. So I didn't notice it on the tatami at all. I didn't notice it bend whatsoever when I cut into a big target, and didn't frankly cut through, so a lot of shock was absorbed by the sword. But later on, it started bending and kind of kept getting worse. So it's certainly on the softer side, and that's why, again, the HRC measurements that I took don't seem to really line up. Anyway, moving on from there, I threw it at the tree. It would bend sometimes. Overall, the handle and stuff stayed pretty solid, and it wasn't until I was throwing it at the tree, I believe that's the part where I started to notice that the handle was broken, and I could wiggle it around a little bit after throwing it at a tree. I cut a shaving cream can as well, more or less just because it's kind of fun. Well, it's fun. It makes for good camera footage. It left the same kind of characteristic scratches in the blade and diminishment on the edge, though the edge didn't take a lot of damage, didn't chip or roll as much as others have, but I could certainly notice that the edge was diminished and damaged. It would need to be sharpened, though it could still be sharpened and used and straightened at this point if that was something that was a concern. From there, I brought it to the Croquet Stake. I hit it once and then realized I should probably break out the brass fitting on the metal barrel. The Croquet Stake and brass fitting honestly gave really similar results in terms of damaging the edge. The Croquet Stake was certainly worse, but the brass fitting also damaged and pushed the edge back about 1 millimeter, not a huge amount, but it still pushed the edge back a little bit. I didn't notice chunks breaking off. It seemed to kind of chip off in some spots, but also roll a little bit in others, which again makes me think that I'm not measuring the HRC right, or maybe I just measured one spot and I should measure the spots that I'm actually going to be hitting, which now that I think about it is probably the fairer thing to do. I digress. Then I hit it on the brass fitting. It took some damage. From there, I brought it to the Croquet Stake of Doom. It would bend, it would chip, it would do that kind of stuff, and eventually it broke. And in this case, it broke before I had to switch it and strike it on the spine. It broke striking edge first, which is not something terribly common, particularly not something common on softer steel. They tend to be more forgiving, take a lot more bends before they crack. And it flew off also in a direction that I was not predicting. So it's the reason I'm wearing the face mask and the thing over my vitals is, you know, they fly off in weird directions and it's easy to hurt yourself. So don't do this at home, right? Anyway, that's where it broke. It broke quicker than honestly I would have expected for something lighter, and that was a little bit on the surprising. It didn't take a whole lot of edge damage up into beating it on the Croquet Stake of Doom. You kind of could sharpen out or reprofile the edge and straighten the sword out and still have it be totally functional, but it eventually failed pretty catastrophically and flew off again prior to me having to strike it on the spine. All right, sword friends, that's the meat and potatoes of the video. I've talked about the build quality and showed you the high-res video. I've talked about using it as a practitioner, and you got to see my dumb face move it around. And then I pushed it to failure and commented on the pros and cons of that as well. Hopefully, the video has been enough to help you determine if it's worth your $350 or not. But it is now the point of the video where I answer that question for myself. And to me, the answer is no. I don't think it's worth 350 bucks. And it's not that it's bad or it's a ripoff, or if there's something about it that you like that I wouldn't say it's a worthy option to consider, but it doesn't seem to demonstrate a particularly good value to me. $350 now can buy you a lot of sword, and in this case there were a lot of little nuances, some very nice features with the differential hardening and the pretty hamon and the silk and the hishigami and the real rayskin panels, but I've seen those on other $350 swords that are also better executed. If I look at the handle, I'm not a fan of the tab construction, though, like I said, it's not a deal breaker, but the handle did break. Other handles have survived all the way to the end of testing and not broken at all. The silk feels nice, but I've experienced that. I would rather have a handle that stayed together through really abusive stuff than felt a little bit more supple. And frankly, I've had nice feeling silk on other swords in this price category on handles that held up a little better and weren't as boxy and didn't show the protrusions along the lines of the Samigawa panels. If I move up to the Saya, it was honestly comfortable. I got used to it. That's acceptable in this price category and frankly par for the course. Overall, it drew and it was fine as a practitioner's tool. Again, there was nothing to say that it was exceptional at it, but also it held up and did that job reasonably well. When I go to cutting, though, it held up for a bit, and I suspected that it would be fine, especially after cutting into the big, robust, kind of rolled newspaper and not taking any damage. But once it took damage, it was really easy to bend. It continued bending, and it strikes me that the blade is probably a little bit soft. I've used other swords that are differentially hardened on the same types of targets, and they have not sustained the same type of damage. They haven't been as soft. They haven't taken a bend as easily, even though they were differentially hardened. Further, I can't see the hamon terribly well. Again, not something that I would really critique on a sword of this price point, but I've seen other swords that did all of those other things a little bit better and showed the hamon a little bit better as well. So they're just not, the pieces aren't coming together as well as I think the other examples have in the $350 category, whether it be Skydro, Huawei, Ronin Katana. The Dojo Pro was certainly more durable. But even the RK series from Ronin Katana that's less expensive than this, I think shows the hamon about the same and has held up to more abuse, and it's a less expensive sword. Anyway, to me, it just doesn't represent a particularly good value for the money. It's not a bad deal. It's not horrible. It's not the end of the world, but I've played around with other $350 swords that have held up better in just about each one of those categories. They've either been more fun to use for Iaido or held up better to abusive, dumb testing in my backyard, or cut better, had better edge retention, and the like. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Hopefully it's been interesting. Again, if you are keen on getting one, I will link in the description down below where you can get one at Cult of Athena. I do want to also say thank you to them for sending it my way. I know I said it's not something that I would personally say is a yes. It's a pass for me, but I still do genuinely appreciate them sending it to me. It was a lot of fun to test. I really enjoy the process of doing it. I hope it was interesting and helpful, and I hope that they further make some improvements. Hopefully the critiques that I'm giving are things that they can bring back to their suppliers and improve on over time, with a little bit of tweaking on the heat treatment, a little bit of tweaking on the Ido, or on the handle, the Ito, and the wrap and stuff. I think this I would change my tune quite a bit, and it would be a lot more compelling offering. Anyway, that's all I've got. Hopefully it's been interesting. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.